Denis, many thanks. Pleasure to be here with you today. I'm actually delighted to see a university start to think seriously about this issue of free trade and how to rebalance free trade, how to reinvent trade, international trade. If you look at international trade today, it's chaos. I mean, it's complete disaster. I mean, nobody's respecting WTO's rule anymore. China has probably never respected WTO's rules, unfortunately. The US, who has designed and architected the World Trade Organization's rules over the past 50 years, well, WTO obviously is more recent, but international trade over the past 50 years or more, is not respecting these rules anymore. Only Europe actually still respects or tries to respect. European Union tries to respect these rules, but it's complete chaos. And I'm glad to see again academia, professors and students starting to think about this. In fact, I believe that there's even an opportunity to be one day maybe a Nobel Prize in economy if you invent the next rules that everybody's going to abide by for international trade. I guess it's probably your opportunity as a young, brilliant student from wherever, because you can come from wherever, in fact, to be the next Nobel Prize in this area. So let me maybe introduce myself a little bit to tell you a bit where I come from and why I'm interested in this topic. I'm indeed an entrepreneur. I was born and raised in Lyon, second city after Paris, a city of entrepreneurs. Lots of successful French entrepreneurs actually come from Lyon. I mean, the founder of Danone, for example, of Accor, I mean, of several large French corporations were born and raised there. But it's also a city where social rights have been invented, or at least, if they've not been invented, they've been experimented in a very, very tough manner, and probably one of the first places in the world where they've been experimented. Back in 1831, and a few years later, we had very brutal strikes between textile workers and the police and the government at the time. La révolte des canuts in French. The canuts, that's the name of the people who were rioting at the time. They were rioting because their bosses were trying to lower the salaries. I mean, obviously, if you try to do this, you're probably going to get a riot today. So these guys started rioting, and the government at the time, what did the government do? They just shot the people. And that happened in where I was born. And so when I grew up, and I was talking about this over lunch with your professors, I mean, I was obviously bred in a family actually of entrepreneurs. My grandfather was an entrepreneur, my great-grandfather was an entrepreneur, but also brought up in an environment where shooting people because they were striking was just very, very wrong, you know. And that, you know, respecting social standards, respecting the right of people is absolutely a right of worker, is absolutely fundamental. And so after my years in Lyon, I went to business school in Paris. I'm not an economist. Actually, I must warn you about this. I mean, I'm going to talk about economy and economic theory, but I'm not an economist, so forgive me if I say stupid things. But I'm more trying to bring you a grassroots experience of world trade and issues with world trade. So I went to Paris, attended a business school, and then after a few years after graduation, I became an entrepreneur myself. At the age of 27, I created a first company called Business Objects with 10,000 euros in the Paris area with really nothing, in a small, smelly office with a partner of mine. We had left Oracle, a big American software company, and we decided to try and start our own Oracle. Actually worked very well. The company was very successful, became a world leader in its space. We conquered the world, starting from nothing. In 7 years, we had a presence in 50 countries, 15 directly, the rest through distributors. Our customers were large corporates. In fact, our first customer was EDF, the big French electric utility. And then, you know, lots of other corporates, you know, like Renault, Peugeot. And then we went to the US. Our customers were Boeing, Texas Instruments, Disney, Goldman Sachs, the NASA, a number of large US administration were also customers. The US Army actually is still a customer of the company. He has 100,000 licenses apparently still in use. what we did is we invented a new way for end users to access corporate data, and we made it really easy. Company went public on Nasdaq less than 5 years after inception. We were named with my partner Best Entrepreneurs in Business Week next to Steve Jobs and Steven Spielberg back in '96. So I mean, beyond our wildest dreams, you know, huge success. And so I experienced international trade firsthand. I mean, I could hop on a plane and go to any country, almost anywhere in the world, and start a business without any barrier. And that was obviously formidable. I mean, a great opportunity. Before that, I had also an interesting experience, which I will talk about in a minute. I was also working, it was actually my military service before starting that company. I worked for Thomson Semiconductor, which is now ST Microelectronics, manufacturer of semiconductors. At the time, you know, military service was compulsory in France, but you could do it working for a large French corporation abroad. So I had a chance to do this in the US, you know, for like 15 months. And I experienced also the battle already between the US, Japan, Europe, and also a first interesting experience on how free trade works and some of the issues. But I'll come back to this in a minute. So Thomson, business objects. Then I created another company, which was an e-logistic company called Kiala, which has built networks of collection points. When you order online, you wanted your parcel to be delivered in a local store as opposed to be delivered at home, which can be complicated when you're working. And so we started with a network of 100 collection points in Belgium, as a matter of fact. And then we expanded a network of 7,000 collection points around Europe primarily. And back in 2012, UPS corporate in Atlanta and their head office also for Europe in Belgium came to us and told us, hey, we like what you're doing, we'd like to acquire your company. And we became part of UPS, and I spent 18 months helping them deploy the service in a number of other countries. Today the service is deployed in 140 countries under the name UPS Access Point. So here as well, I saw firsthand, you know, how free trade can be beneficial, how, you know, it was so easy for us to go to any country and to start a business and to then help UPS do the same later on. So I'm a product. I'm a child of free trade. You know, I experienced free trade and all the benefits of free trade firsthand. And then after this experience, I started another company called Nature and People First, my current job. This company specializes in energy storage for the energy transition to help store renewable energy, solar and wind. And as you know, solar and wind are great, except that there's not always sun and wind. And so there's intermittency. You have to deal with this in order to provide a 24/7 service. You have to have ways to store energy so that when the sun goes away, you can, you know, people go back home at like 6 p.m., they turn on the light, turn on the oven. Actually, there's a peak consumption time in every country around the world between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. And so this is when the sun has gone, usually. So you need energy storage to provide energy at this point in time, and then during the rest of the night, obviously, when the sun is gone. And there are several ways to do this, to store energy. There's a traditional way, historical way, which is what I'm doing, which is called pump hydroelectric storage, PHS, or STEP in French, Système de transfert d'énergie par pompage, PHS. Technology was invented 100 years ago by a German engineer. It consists in using water in a closed loop. When energy is cheap, available during the day, solar energy, you're going to pump water from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir. And when you need energy at night or at peak consumption time, at the end of the day, you release the water and you trigger a hydroelectric turbine and you recover 80% of the energy that has been stored. It's like a water battery. So I started doing this back in 2015-16, developing this in 2 areas. In the French Caribbean, because a big EDF told me, still had friends at EDF, you know, they were my first customer many, many years ago, they remembered. They told me, go to the Caribbean, because that's where we need this. In the Caribbean, French Caribbean, Martinique and Guadeloupe, energy comes from very CO2 emitting power plants using oil very often. And so it's extremely CO2 emitting, and they're not interconnected. So they cannot go to other parts of the world to access energy when they need energy. So they are very unstable networks. And they have invested a lot in photovoltaic, in solar and wind, because they have a lot of sun and a lot of wind. And so they need your products, they need your approach. So we started working on this project in Martinique. I also started working on projects in the US. Actually relocated back to Boston for 4 years, between 2016 and 2019, to start the Martinique project and to try to do the same thing in the US. I'm also doing this in the US, in the Navarro Nation today, because I have a friend from Boston who knows the Navarro Nation very well and who recommended to go there. And the good news is Navarro Nation is very prone, is very qualified for projects like that. They have elevation change, they have water, they have electric interconnections which are being freed up with the closure of coal-fired power plants. And they also have very supportive people because it's a very poor area, and so they need jobs and they need money, coming from projects like that. So I started working also on projects in the US. And what I discovered along the way is that my main competitor was actually the second option, which are lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries can store energy as well, very effectively, and is clearly an alternative to what we're doing. And very quickly I realized that we didn't have to follow the same rules. Lithium-ion batteries, when you look at the supply chain of lithium-ion batteries, it's a poster child of what's wrong with international trade. I mean, it starts with the extraction of cobalt in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is everything but democratic, but they like to label themselves democratic. It starts with extraction of cobalt in the DRC, with child labor, children involved in these mines, with very young children very often, workers who are not protected, who are not wearing masks or helmets, in mines which are not supported, so mines just fall apart, and people don't even dig to go get these people out of the mine that has crumbled. I mean, it's a complete disaster. It's not in all the mines in the DRC, but it's in a number of artisanal mines, what they call artisanal mines, which is still a big part of the production. And there's an estimate of 200,000 workers working in these artisanal mines. So we're not talking about a small number of people, including children. So a complete disaster from a human standpoint and from an environmental standpoint as well. Then the process involves also the extraction of lithium in the main countries where you can extract lithium, on the Atacama region in the Andes, so in Chile, in Argentina, and in China. In fact, lithium, 95% of the global production of lithium comes from 4 countries only. It comes from Australia, China, 25%, and the rest comes from Argentina and Chile. And when you extract lithium, you need a lot of water, and you need to manipulate a lot of water. And in a country like China, where there are essentially very few or no environmental standards, this water, which is highly polluted, is then being sent into local rivers. And there are reports in the Washington Post, in very serious sources, reporting about thousands of fish which are being killed by this process. And then the final part of the process involves refining and manufacturing in China. And because it happens in China, happens according to Chinese labor standards. And Chinese labor standards, as you may know or may not know, are extremely low, very, very low. It's not uncommon that salaries are not being paid. And you have workers' council where you can go. If you're a worker, you've not been paid for a number of months, you can go to a workers' council. But if you do that, the first thing you have to do is you have to pay upfront 4 or 5 months of salary to just be listened to by the workers' council. So imagine you've not been paid for 6 months, you have to go to the workers' council, you have to pay another 4 or 5 months of salary to just be listened to. You don't have any free union in China. There's only one official union, and the president of this official union is a prominent member of the Chinese Communist Party. So easy to understand that what's happening is that unions are just not free and are not effective. In fact, China is even going backwards in this area. I mean, a few years ago, there used to be activists, usually lawyers, who were trying to help people in a dire situation. For example, you had employees on large construction sites in Shanghai or Beijing who had caught lung disease because they were not wearing any protection, and so they were breathing dust all the time, and they were coughing, and they had very severe disease. And so you had activists who were trying to help them, usually lawyers, you know. Since Xi Jinping became the leader of China, all these people have been arrested, have been sent to re-education camps. So China used to be a bit better than they are today. They're worse now than they used to be, and they were not going very far. So social standards in China are very, very low, inexistent. And in fact, they resemble what we used to know in Europe and the US in the 19th century. I mean, it's like it's like a travel in time. When you go to some of these countries, in China in particular, it's like going to the France of Émile Zola, you know, or the UK of Charles Dickens, you know. Essentially very, very low, inexistent labor standards. And an inability to improve these labor standards because of the absence of independence of unions. And so a willingness from the government to prevent labor standards from improving. So very low environmental standards, very low labor standards. And I was promoting my pump storage projects in the US and in Europe, and the people I was talking to were telling me, oh, what about your costs? So I was presenting my costs, and they were telling me, oh, but you know, you're much more expensive than these Chinese batteries. And I'm like, yes, obviously, because I'm going to have people who are going to work on these sites in Martinique. They're going to have full protection. They're going to have a retirement plan. They're going to have a healthcare plan. They're going to have the right to join a free union. If they're not being paid, they're going to have the right to go and blame me if I don't pay them, and they're going to get this sorted out very, very quickly. This is not an issue for them. And so all that obviously costs a lot more than people who are essentially no right. Knowing that, by the way, that recently the New York Times also reported that in the manufacturing process of lithium-ion batteries, there is also forced labor, Uyghur forced labor. So you have slavery or semi-slavery on one hand, and you have 21st century social standards from Western countries on the other side. And then you have decision makers who are telling you, good luck in this competition. And I'm saying, you know what? We European entrepreneurs, American entrepreneurs, you give us the rights that Chinese entrepreneurs have. You know, they have the right to slavery and semi-slavery. Obviously, they're very, very successful. Give me the right to slavery and semi-slavery, I'm going to be very successful. Obviously, I don't want that, you know, because I'm come from Lyon, you know, and I'm against, you know, slavery and semi-slavery. These are not my values. But you would give us the same rights, you know, we'd be very, very successful as well. So I was shocked by that. I was just shocked. And, you know, I didn't mention this in my bio, but I was also an activist previously. I was involved in fighting to defend actually entrepreneurs, innovative entrepreneurs in France. Many years ago, I created an entrepreneurs association called Croissance Plus, who has obtained the creation of a tool, for example, to involve employees and share the wealth creation with employees. So I've been an activist. So I decided to wear my activist cap again. And what was the most effective way to wear my activist cap again and to talk about this? It was to write a book, to talk about this, and to try and come up with suggestions. And again, I'm not an economist, so I'm trying to come up with suggestions as an entrepreneur, you know. But my goal was, and is still, to essentially open the debate on that. And so I wrote a book, and because I did what I did, I, you know, grew up building companies around the world. I worked in the US back in the 90s. You know, I've seen the evolution of free trade, and I've seen what happened. I understand what happened. And before we talk about solutions, let me tell you what happened and why we ended up with this crazy situation where we're telling people from Western countries, you're going to have to compete with people who have no rights and who have no standards, and let's the best win. You know, it's like organizing a soccer championship telling some of the teams you're going to have to respect a lot of rules, and the other teams you don't have to respect any rules. That's fine. Is that going to work? Who's going to win? Who's even going to compete? You know, personally, I don't play soccer, but I'd be playing soccer. I would refuse to compete, you know, in a championship like that. It's crazy, you know. And so how did we get there? How did we get there? And all this is highly documented. Everything I'm going to tell you is highly documented. It's documented in my book. I have a few books here you can take back home if you want, if you read French. But you received, I guess some of you received an abstract in English. What happened is there was a shock on Western economies coming from Asia, coming from Japan in the 90s. You're probably too young, most of you, to remember. But in the 90s, there was a shock of excellence. It was not a shock of standards. It was a shock of excellence coming from Japan. And I was working for Thomson Semiconductor at the time in the US, in Philadelphia. So I remember that time when my company was selling memories and competing with Japanese memories. And the Japanese memories were just much cheaper, much better. And why was that? Because the Japanese had mastered management methods that were extremely innovative, that Western companies did not master. And funny enough, these management methods had been taught to them by American consultants after World War II. And these management methods were about, you may know about this, Kanban, quality circles, ways to improve manufacturing in an extremely effective way. Talking to your employees, telling them, tell me what's wrong, allow me to improve the process. I was myself, didn't mention that, but I was myself also as part of my experience. I was a worker in a Japanese factory back in 1983. I saw that firsthand. I took part in Quality Circle in Tomakomai, Hokkaido. I've seen this working, whereby every week we would get together and the boss would tell all of us, give me an idea on how to improve the process. You know, and so quality circles were extremely effective. Kanban, just in time. They had to store only a sufficient amount of parts that were necessary at a given point in time. They didn't have to store a huge inventory of parts. So all these major Chinese, extremely effective at competing with European and American companies. And they were slaughtered. I mean, they came up with cars also, which were very good and very inexpensive. And their standards were very similar to ours. You know, it was not a battle of standards. You know, they were respecting their employees. It was not the issue. They were respecting the environment. I mean, their history, their economic history, industrial history was very comparable to ours. So they had very similar standards. It was not a battle of standards. It was again a shock of excellence. And so what was the reaction in Europe and the US? It was protectionism. Let's close the borders. I mean, in France, we forced the Japanese to take their video cassettes to Poitiers. I remember. Crazy ideas to try and block them. In the US, they invented all kinds of things as well. And obviously everybody trying to learn the Japanese methods, you know. I mean, at that time in business school, it was all about Kanban and just in time and quality circles, and that was the right approach, obviously, to try and learn from them and become as good as they are. But at one point in time, a number of American CEOs, you may know American, some of you may be American, and no disrespect. I mean, I'm a fan of the US, you know, spending a lot of time there as well. But Americans, they like quick results, you know. They like quick and effective results. And so what a number of American CEOs started saying, they said, hey, you know, it's going to take forever to learn Kanban and quality circles and become as good as the Japanese. Why don't we just go and get, you know, labor from cheap countries, from countries which have cheap labor. And that's where the idea of NAFTA started, North American Free Trade Agreement, going and get labor from Mexico in particular. And there was a huge coalition of American companies called USA NAFTA. All this is documented. Huh? It's totally transparent. Totally what I'm saying is totally documented. Called USA NAFTA, with a phenomenal lobbying organization where they went to convince members of parliament in the US to vote a free trade agreement with Mexico. And they got it. They got it. Obviously, trade unions tried to oppose it in a big way because they also got it. They also understood that American workers would be put in direct competition with Mexican workers. with enormous differences in standards and in social standards. And this battle occurred between 1990 and 1992 and 3. It was a big part also of the presidential election in 92, with Clinton on one hand, George Bush the father, and also actually an entrepreneur, an independent entrepreneur called Ross Perot, very successful entrepreneur, which started EDS, big successful IT company. And Ross Perot was a candidate. And Ross Perot was actually the only one who was against NAFTA. I mean, USA NAFTA has managed to convince both the Democrats and the Republicans that it was making sense to go and offshore massive amounts of jobs to Mexico. Ross Perot actually collected 18% of the popular votes in 1990. He was actually quite successful at pitching that this was not the right idea. Ross Perot had a famous quote. He was saying that we're going to hear American jobs going down the drain, going to the south, to Mexico. I mean, we're going to see a massive loss of jobs going all the way to Mexico because of these rules, because of NAFTA. And everybody was just making fun of him, saying, oh, yeah, come on, I mean, you're crazy. No, it's going to be very positive. I mean, we have all kinds of surveys, demonstrating that it's going to be very positive. And so NAFTA was decided. And obviously, who was wrong and who was right? Obviously, a lot of jobs were lost. And the theory at the time was that it was okay to lose a number of jobs because, and that was partially true, because it would enable American citizens to access, cheap products. So in terms of purchasing power, it was not a bad idea. And the people who were going to lose their job, well, we're going to pay them to stay at home, It's going to be so beneficial that we're going to have the means to pay these people to stay at home without a job. And that was essentially the reasoning behind that. And then it did not stop there. Then, because NAFTA initially was perceived as so successful, that the second leg of this unlimited and unethical free trade, that's how I call it, which became an ideology, I mean, where people don't question whether it's good or right, The second leg happened, and the second phase happened, and the biggest one, and the one we're in the middle of today, and still deeply in the middle of, and the consequences, is China joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. So about 10 years later, 9 years later, so first step, NAFTA, 92. Second step, China joining the WTO in 2001. And the promise there was, hey, it's the end of history. Have you heard about the book from Francis Fukuyama, published actually in those years, in 92, I think. The end of history. Capitalism had won. We're all going to be friends. There's no communists anymore. Well, the Chinese, they still label themselves communists, but not communists anymore. I mean, they're capitalists. And that was true. They were becoming very capitalist. Very aggressively, actually. Even worse than us, And so it's the end of history. We're all friends. So let's divide labor among countries. And let's go source cheap labor in these countries who have cheap labor. And everything's going to be fine. We're going to bring cheap products to our countries, and we're going to conquer also these economies, the massive market, obviously, the Chinese market, more than 1 billion consumers potentially. I mean, people were dreaming about that. And so here as well, massive lobbying convinced everyone that China has to join the WTO. And China was supposed, when joining the WTO, was supposed to become a market economy. They agreed on that. Becoming a market economy meant stopping massive subsidies to Chinese companies, meant stopping the Chinese government mingling into the economy, so not owning a lot of corporations, meant stopping what the Chinese were doing already very aggressively, forcing joint ventures with foreign companies and forcing technology transfers with foreign companies, and enabling also a legal system that was fair, which was absolutely not the case. The Chinese legal system was massively, and is still massively, skewed toward Chinese companies. I mean, there are famous examples. I mean, there's one example of a French company called Schneider Electric. I mean, Schneider Electric selling electric components. They were selling a switch, an electric switch, let's call it like that, which they had at their catalog since the 1930s. The catalog of Merlin-Gérard, you know Merlin-Gérard, I'm sure, from Grenoble. They had this switch at the catalog since the 1930s. And they were selling it in China. And all of a sudden, one of the Chinese competitors sued them and said, "You've copied my electric switch. Chinese company was like 10 years old. I mean, they could not have, you know, it was obviously Merlin-Gérard, it was in the 30s. And you know what? Schneider Electric lost. And they had to pay $30 million of fine because they had supposedly copied this Chinese company. It was totally skewed. And Schneider Electric did not complain about that. That was also happening very often and making the situation very difficult. They did not complain because they were worried about retaliation. They were worried about retaliation in China. And they said, okay, too bad, we're going to abandon that product, which is kind of low end, and we're going to focus only on the high end, and we're going to let our competitor focus on that low end product. And there are tons of stories like that. So China joining the WTO and agreeing to change all that. And we know what happened now. I mean, China didn't change any of their practices. China kept on subsidizing massively a number of strategic areas. According to the WTO, you're allowed only to subsidize R&D. It's the only thing you're allowed to subsidize. You're not allowed to subsidize production. You're not allowed to subsidize export. You're not allowed to subsidize anything but R&D. China kept on subsidizing massively all kinds of industries. And because of the nature of the Chinese regime and the Chinese government, and I'm not against China, by the way, I love the Chinese people. I mean, I think the Chinese people is you know, I'm more a bit against the Chinese regime, although I'm not even against China, I'm not even in favor of regime change. I'm just hoping that one day the Chinese government understands that it's probably not serving them to behave like that, you know, not serving their interests and their people and their economy. So they kept on subsidizing massively a number of industries. And on top of that, they also prevented social rights and environmental standards from improving. And again, we've organized a direct competition between countries where we have 150 years of social history in the West, starting in the early 19th century, and countries which have essentially no history. We have 50 years of environmental history in the West. In China, they have almost no history. They're just starting. And they're starting in a context where local authorities are preventing this from improving because there's no democracy. Why do we have 150 years of history, and why do we have standards which have improved over 150 years in both the social area and environmental area? Because we have democracy. Because people can express, can voice their concerns, and can get rid of a government which is not respecting the people or nature. And so because of that, China has kept their social standards and their environmental standards at a very low level. It's improving, but very, very, very slowly. And thanks to this strategy, it's improving slowly because people have to riot. Obviously, when you riot in China, you're in trouble, you know. So people don't riot very often, you know. But sometimes they riot, and so the government, you know, let go on a few topics, you know. And okay, we're gonna, you know, improve this or that. But obviously, it doesn't happen very quickly, you know. Well, to be fair, in 1831, you know, with the Canu, we're a bit like that. Huh? We were shooting people who were going on strike. Huh? We're not very different from the Chinese government at the time. Huh? Not to blame them necessarily for that. You know, we've been there. We've been there. And it's like, you know, you have capitalism 1.0. Capitalism 1.0 is capitalism without any social or environmental standards. It's France, England, the US in the 19th century. Then you have capitalism 2.0. Capitalism 2.0 is the beginning of social standards, minimal social standards. So it's France, the UK, the US in the 20th century. And then you have capitalism 3.0, which is the combination of demanding social standards and demanding environmental standards. This is what we live in today in the Western world. Capitalism 3.0. China is today at the level of capitalism 1.0. 1.0. And so we're organizing a confrontation between capitalism 1.0 and capitalism 3.0. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's just unfair. It's just completely unfair. Again, it's the World Championship in soccer I was talking about earlier. Don't have the same rules, so it cannot work. It can only fail miserably. And it's what happened. Has failed miserably. I mean, when you look at the consequences, they're terrible. I mean, the consequences from a strategic standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a political standpoint, are a complete disaster. I mean, Trump got elected in 2016 because of that, and re-elected because of that. It was a riot by the working class against this system that had made them lose their job. I mean, this has been documented by an MIT professor called David Otter, which I recommend you read, who's demonstrated a direct correlation between counties in the US who've been most impacted by free trade with China and by a switch from a Democratic vote, because they were voting Democratic before, to a Trump vote in 2016. There have been similar surveys conducted in the UK, in France, by economists as well, showing the same thing, showing a direct correlation between a radical populist vote and the loss of jobs because of trade, because of unbalanced free trade. So the consequences from a political standpoint, social and political standpoint, are a disaster. At least very significant. I'm not against Mr. Trump, obviously, you know, but we see that people are essentially rioting. They're not happy. They're not happy with what happened. They lost their job, they lost their future, they lost hope. You cannot tell people, you're going to lose your job, but we're going to pay you to stay at home. Come on. I mean, is that my future? To be unemployed for the rest of my life, to have no role in society because you don't need me, you don't need my workforce anymore? I mean, this is a joke. You cannot tell people that. I mean, this is not serious. And this is what they did. That was the deal. That was the deal, huh? Seriously. The deal was, yeah, we're going to lose a number of jobs, but don't worry. I mean, these people, we're going to pay these people to stay at home. I mean, the benefits are going to be such that we're going to afford to do that, you know. So that's the first consequence, you know, people losing hope. The working class rioting. Happened in the UK as well. The Brexit. Remember who voted for the Brexit? I mean, the Greater London voted in favor of the Brexit, but the rest of England voted for the Brexit because anything foreign was suspicious. And it was obviously a big mistake because they were rejecting not only China, but they were also rejecting people who were very similar to them and countries that were very similar to them. Free trade works when countries are similar. Capitalism 3.0 doing business with capitalism 3.0, that works. Capitalism 1.0 doing business with capitalism 3.0 doesn't work. Too unbalanced. Too unbalanced. And so the Brexit, the rise of the National Front in France, directly related to this, was also demonstrated by an economist from the Banque de France who's conducted the same kinds of surveys. And we know that the vote for Marine Le Pen comes primarily from the northern part of France and the eastern part of France, which are regions which have been devastated by a number of these rules. So the social and political consequences are enormous. And then, by the way, interesting to see also, what did the people who were supposed to represent the working class, what did they do? What did the parties do? What did the Democrat and the Labour Party in the UK and the Socialists in France and a number of other countries, what did they do? They also abandoned these people completely. It's also documented. What they did is they went after minorities. And that's obviously a good idea. I mean, minorities have to be defended, obviously, as well. Gays and lesbians and the black community in the US and so forth, except that they went a bit too far, you know. They went a bit too woke, you know. And so they've been beaten flat out recently in the recent elections because they were not defending the working class anymore. Democrats have suffered the biggest loss recently, just recently, a few weeks ago, as you know, because they stopped representing the working class and because the only person they believe is representing them, rightly or wrongly, is Donald Trump. Wrongly, I believe, because Biden had done a few good things also for the working class. Biden had decided to be tougher with China than Trump in his previous mandate. And he was indeed tougher in many ways. What he did with the IRA and so forth, I mean, was much tougher than what Trump had done previously. But the people remembered, you know, the initial Coke, you know, version of Coke. They didn't like Pepsi, you know. They preferred Coke to Pepsi, you know. They preferred Trump because Trump had been the first one to act on this and to say, I'm going to defend the people who are suffering from these free trade agreements, which are unbalanced, you know. Trump keeps on talking about this, you know. These deals are stupid, you know, they've not been well negotiated and so forth. It's obviously very radical, you know Trump, you know. So same thing also in Europe. And the other consequence beside the political and social consequences is strategic. Huge strategic consequences, enormous, that we see every day. 2 days ago, China decided to weaponize, that's the word they use, once again, their dominance in rare earth. Familiar with rare earths? Rare earth are products which are not necessarily rare in the earth crust, but there are very small quantities. And so to extract rare earth, you have, so their name are very funny, you know, their name I like, I'm going to give you a few of the names. You probably, yeah, so the names are, for example, they're used in computer chips and various chip making and high bandwidth memory chips. And also they have military applications like gallium, germanium, antimony. There are like 19 different products which are rare earth. I'm going to write the name of a few of them, especially those which are involved in what I'm talking about. So gallium, germanium, and antimony. There are 19 of them. They're not very well known because these are industrial products, obviously. And so what China decided to do, they decided to ban the export of these products to the US. And that was because the US decided to stop exporting a number of chips to China. There's a trade war going on. But why is China dominating the rare earth segment? Why? 25 years ago, the US had a like 80% market share in rare earth. 80%. Now China has 90%. And the US is a marginal player. As the rest of the world, obviously, because China has 90% market share. Why is that? Because to extract rare earth, you have to manipulate an enormous quantity of earth. And you have to use chemical products to separate gallium, germanium, these products from Earth's crust. The refining of rare earth is extremely consuming in terms of water and in terms of chemical products. And if you don't have very strict regulations, you end up polluting enormously the environment. China is essentially no regulation. So their cost to do that was ridiculous. The cost in the US and the rest of the world is far superior, 5 to 10 times superior. But because we decided that the world was flat and we were all friends and it was the end of history and we were all friends, we agreed to let China do that without any rules. And so China is now the king of rare earth. And they're weaponizing that kingdom, this dominance, in a big way. Obviously, environmental standards play a role, but also labor standards, again, as I say. Remember, I mean, a salary in China of a worker in China, in these big industrial cities in China, in Chengdu and Chongqing, average salaries per hour is like $5 to $6 per hour. Average salary in Western Europe, everything included, is $30 to $60 or $70 to do the same thing. So put Chinese labor and Chinese environmental standards, you're the king of the world. Become the king of rare earth. And you can weaponize that. But you're not happy with what the US is doing or anybody else in the world, you control 90%. Happens also with lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries, they control the refining of between 70 and 90% of all products required. The refining, not necessarily the extraction. They control 25% of the extraction of lithium, but they also control the refining of most of the products required. And recently they decided to put export licenses on graphite. So you have companies in Europe and the US who are trying to catch up in the battery space, because in the battery space, lithium battery space, it's the same thing. China controls 90%, 80 to 90% of the market of the lithium-ion batteries, but also of the lithium-ion battery cells, which is a component inside the batteries. They control 80%. And so you have companies trying to catch up. There's a famous company in Europe called Northvolt. You may have heard about it recently. They went down the drain recently. They had raised 15 billion euros. They invested 15 billion euros. They just went bankrupt. They could not catch up, and the Chinese made it even more difficult by putting export licenses on graphite, and they controlled 90% of the world production of graphite because of that, because of this free trade rules, because we agreed to have no borders, no rules when doing business with China, with people who are, again, living in capitalism 1.0 and we live in capitalism 3.0. So the Chinese today, they control the lithium-ion battery market, head and shoulder, 80% market share. They control the solar panel manufacturing, 80% market share. And by the way, solar panels are partially manufactured by Uyghur forced labor. Again, slavery. We don't have right to slavery here. You give me the right to put slaves in a factory, I'd be as good as the Chinese. You know, easy. I don't have that right. They control now a growing share of the wind turbines. Europeans and Americans used to lead. GE, Vestas, number of large companies. Their market share is going down the drain right now. The market is starting to be heavily controlled by Chinese manufacturers for the same reasons. In fact, because of what I call in my book, the triple dumping. The triple dumping. The first dumping, well known, well accepted, are subsidies, government subsidies. Again, beyond what the WTO allows you to do. So massive dumping on export, on manufacturing, on everything. Under all kinds of shapes and forms, you know, direct subsidies, but also tax rebates. I mean, they're very creative, you know. They do a lot of things to help their companies. And then the second forms of dumping, social dumping and environmental dumping. The triple dumping. Because of the triple dumping, Western companies cannot compete, are essentially non-existent in a number of industries, which are key industries. And again, that's the second main consequence, besides the social and political consequences that we were talking about earlier, it's the strategic consequences. We, Western countries, have lost complete control of a number of key industries for our future. Having to buy only Chinese products to build our future electric grid is a big issue. We cannot allow that to happen. If there is, at one point in time, a conflict with China, it means we cannot maintain our electric grid because we're sourcing everything from China. It's happening also in the telco space. When I was heading business objects, I had telecommunication equipment manufacturer. I had like 6 of them. There was AT&T's the US, Northern Telecom in Canada, Alcatel in France, Siemens in Germany, Nokia and Ericsson in the Nordics. Today, there are only 2 who are left. Impressively, those coming from the smallest countries. Nokia and Ericsson are still left, are still there. And they're competing head-on with Huawei. And it's a very tough competition because Huawei has access to the triple dumping. Triple dumping. Very tough to compete against Huawei. And why is it an issue? Telecommunication equipment, cell towers, think about it. It's easy to put software in there to control your towers and decide to switch them on and off. There's a battle, there's a conflict. You disagree with my new trade rules? Boom, I'm going to switch off. So I need to I need to conclude. I need to conclude. So I conclude quickly. What can we do? What can we do? What I think we should be doing is just try to rebalance free trade. And in the book, I came up with a number of ideas, and it's up for debate. You know, I'm not a genius. I'm not an economist. I think we should rebalance free trade. And we should, for strategic industries, like telcos, like energy-related industries, we should have compensation at the border, which are making the price of the products coming from these countries equivalent to what they would have costed if they'd been made in our countries. For example, labor costs at $5, labor costs at $30, we should rebalance at the border. That's an idea. Only for strategic industries. And for less strategic industries, have a minor, smaller border tax and very limited, and then give back, actually, 50% of that tax to the country of origin to encourage that country to improve its social and environmental standards, to one day become much better. Repay that money back to the original country, to Bangladesh, to an African country, to help them converge in social standards and environmental standards. And so same thing for environmental discrepancies. And actually, it's starting to happen. You may know that the European Union, I'm glad the European Union is funding this this master, because they're doing great. They've just launched the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is doing exactly that for a number of key industries, for steel and iron, for aluminium, for electricity, for a number of key industries. They are currently trying, and it's not easy, I tell you, but they're trying to rebalance trade because, hey, it's not normal that our steel manufacturers pay carbon taxes, sometimes over $100 per ton, and people in China, steel manufacturing in China and Turkey, they pay no carbon tax. Totally unfair free trade. And so the European Union is starting to work on that very seriously, and I'm glad they're doing that. But what's surprising is that nobody really cares about the differences in social standards. I mean, the next big battle is social standards, and do the same thing for social standards. In fact, funny enough, and I'm going to conclude on that, Danny, is the US is ahead of Europe in that. You may or you may not know that Trump, back in 2021, forced a pay raise for Mexican auto workers, whereby he would allow auto parts from Mexico to enter the US if only Mexican workers would get a pay raise to $16 an hour. So the US and Trump himself is starting to rebalance social standards with Mexico. And he's done this already. He's forced this back in 2020. So rebalancing free trade on social standards is starting to happen in the US. We Europeans, we always pride ourselves of being, ahead on social issues and everything. It's Americans who are doing it right now, not Europeans. Europeans, they don't care. The only thing they care about, and I'm glad they're doing it, it's only the carbon issue. Thank you very much.